So we're going to pick up again on the bottom, page 107. As we read this verse, of course, we should remember that he's both letting the disciples know it's time for him to go, letting these particular disciples know that it's time for them to teach, giving them encouragement to take up that task, but also giving them instructions on how not to go wrong in their path of cultivation and teaching as they leave him. And so the verse is a very kind of succinct, terse way to map out some real strong lessons or instructions. And often these verses by one's teacher are memorized, committed to memory, and so they have that ability to be sort of swallowed without having to reference them through writing. And then often these verses are unpacked both consciously and sort of unconsciously as you go into your cultivation, sometimes in a moment of quiet sitting or a kind of major, even traumatic event. These verses, lines from these verses can come forward and shed light on the situation. So they're not meant just to be lyrical, but they're a mnemonic device to help memory because they're reduced down, but they're also like seeds that are planted in the deep layers of consciousness that may not blossom right at the time that the Master's speaking them, but can come up later. And what's interesting is that the seeds are there, but the fertile conditions for them to ripen is one's own life experience and cultivation. So as that sort of the water and sun of your life and cultivation starts to open up and flourish, these seeds respond in kind. This is very interesting. This is why many cultivators memorize text, verses and prose of text, not because they necessarily understand it at the beginning, but it creates a sort of reservoir or a repository that can be drawn up later over time and then returned to. So in this case, one of the important things he's trying to do is to keep them from straying. This is something that can happen a lot with cultivation, self-cultivation, because principle or truth or the Tao, the way, whatever you may call it, can fight with habits and desires. And so there's this back and forth thing that can often happen. You make one step forward, 2 steps backwards, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, and you feel as if your resolve of yesterday can disappear the next day. And then it comes back, and then you have it, and then it goes again. And it seems to be very elusive, but it's really just the mad mind that's unable to stabilize. So one of the points of holding precepts and sitting meditation is to stabilize or to anchor one's consciousness so that there's not so much fluctuation. Obviously, they've reached a point where there isn't a great deal, and yet we can tell by the previous thing there's still some unresolved emotions and attachments because of their crying and so forth that he pointed out. And yet he's going to give them this verse. It's almost as if not everybody's really ready to go, but it's time. And so he's trying to give them this verse. And the verse is sort of, I see as a kind of kind gesture on his part, as if to say, okay, I was a little harsh with you, you were crying because I was going. I kind of laid into you a little bit. But don't worry, I'm going to give you something here to take with you. And I'm not going to give you these artificial tokens like some of my hair or part of my robe or something. I'm going to give you some mind ground seeds here, right from my heart, right from my true mind, that you can take with you. And this one he calls the true false movement and stillness verse. And then you see his line, see what he does here. He gives them what I was just explaining. He says, recite this verse from memory, and you and I will be of one mind. It's very interesting. So he's saying, I'm giving you the best kind of seeds from my own mind, the things that I can put into words. Now, don't rely too much on the words. Go for the meaning. Go for where they're pointing to. But I'm doing this as an act of generosity and supporting you. And if you cultivate according to it, this is the interesting part. He says, don't just simply memorize it, but cultivate according to it. If you actually embody this and actually measure yourself day to day against these lines, you will never lose the source of our teaching. And I think what he's saying also is you'll never lose contact with me. Because he's gotten to a point where the teaching and him are non-dual. It's not like there's Hui Neng and there's his teaching. He has embodied the teaching has manifest in him, and this is what it means to be a Dharma master. It's one who has mastered the Dharma, but also one who's been mastered by it. And so this is sometimes called a person of the way with no mind, no mark. Everything that they manifest is exemplary of this. And this is considered to be the highest art. I told you once the story about E. Cummings, a poet who said in his stages of life, when he first began, he was just in adoration and a child of his parents. Whatever they did and told him to do, he followed. And then after a while, he said, I became the poet. I became the creator of my poems. And the last stages of my life, I became my poems, and my poems became me. And so he was saying I'd gotten rid of whatever, some sense of self, and became this only the expression of this inspired source of writing. So in this case, the Sixth Patriarch is saying, if you can go into this, you and I will be, all of us would be very close. But the most important part of this is always put it into practice. So the group of monks bowed and begged the master to recite the verse. And here's how it goes. And we have this page and the next. I think maybe I'll just read the whole verse through slowly, and then I won't promise to unpack it all, not tonight or next week or any in the future, because I don't know that I could. But to put it out as sort of seeds that you can just sort of pick up on and listen to. So he says, there's nothing real and solid about anything. Do not view anything as true. If you regard anything as real and true, this is just a view, utterly unreal. If you can embrace the true yourself, just being free of any falseness is the true mind. Your own mind entangled in the false, then nothing's true. Where else would you find the true? Sentient beings can move about, insentient things are immobile. If you cultivate a practice of immobility, you'll be like insentient things, frozen. If you seek true stillness, it is movement in stillness. Not moving immobilizes, deadens. And sentient things lack the Buddha seed. Insentient things lack the Buddha seed. Skillfully discerning amid all appearances, yet not being turned by them, is the cardinal meaning. The ability to discern in this way is itself the true nature at work. I tell you, students of the way, exert yourselves and take heed. Do not cling to understandings bound up in birth and death, right at the gateway of the supreme vehicle. If you resonate with these words, then let's talk of Buddhahood together. If there's no resonance, then put your palms together and just be happy. The root source of this teaching is non-contention. Arguing is not the meaning of the way. For in clinging to or opposing the teaching, essential nature embraces birth and death. So there's just many layers of what's going on here. Often I find with verses like this, any rendering of trying to interpret it is not exactly a stab in the dark, but only partial. I don't know that there's an exhaustive interpretation you could give to this. And each of us, given our own conditions, will hear this differently. You have to imagine knowing some of these disciples, because you knew their stories and the lively encounters, how they might be hearing this, given their backgrounds and their conditions, how little Shan Hui is hearing this. Each one will hear it differently based on something that's happened to them, or based on something they saw happen to somebody else. But meanings and interpretations with these texts, the Avatamsaka says, are legion and prolific. They just go on and on like flowers, unfolding and unfurling one after the other. There's no exhaustibility to them, because they continually to speak to the human condition, but they speak to an evolving human condition. So at a beginning stage, you just came in the door, you haven't taken precepts, you haven't really decided what the point of your life is, whether you're going to cultivate something spiritual or try to, go off to war and be a hero, or, make a lot of money. These verses will resonate in one way, or maybe not at all. Somebody who's been practicing for a while, they'll come to you in a different way, and they'll open up in a different way. And they may open up next week in yet a different way. And somebody who's right on the verge of full awakening will hear this and have a totally different response. So there's going to be differences in seeing and hearing, although the words themselves are the same. They don't change. And we're looking at words that are coming out of the Tang Dynasty to 21st century America, and we are probably a different group in some ways than those disciples. But what's interesting is that we're probably not so different either, or we wouldn't be here. So that being said, let's just look and talk a little bit about this. What's he getting at? One thing to remember always with the Sixth Patriarch is he's always, and he says it himself, I'm always teaching to the essential nature and from the essential nature. I'm teaching from the mind, heart ground of my own being and understanding to yours. I'm not, and anything I use is trying to either open that up in you or catalyze that in you, or have you recognize it as I'm speaking. But it's going to, you have all you need whole and complete within you, and the teaching is only to activate that. That's what it means to teach to and from this essential nature. So the words and text he uses are merely expedient devices to try to, I don't know the language, but to have you have a total experience through your mind, through your body, through your emotions, through your hair pores, through your metaphors and imagery. It's to activate that understanding in you with this. So that's the first thing to remember about teaching to and from the essential nature. The other thing he's doing in his teaching is he's not teaching anything. So I want to be clear about this, not to make it seem, like that's mystical or something. He himself says, I have no teaching to give you. I merely expediently untie knots and call it teaching samadhi. And so here again, he's giving them a verse, but we should remember that the purpose of the verse is not so much to impart a teaching, but to speak to their essential nature from his essential nature, and moreover, to release any lingering knots that they might have. So this is, and what their knots are at this point, we could probably infer from reading this what they might be, but at the same time, these are left behind for posterity, and that means they're left behind for us. So let's see, as I would say like this, if you resonate with these words, let's talk about Buddhahood together, and if there's no resonance, just put your palms together and be happy. So at the end of the night, if you just put your palms together and go out happy, you got something. Okay, so there's nothing real or solid about anything. Don't view anything as true. If you regard anything as real and true, this is just a view utterly unreal. What's he hitting at there? I'm saying this, I'm partly kind of saying it rhetorically, but also if anybody wants to weigh in on this, go ahead. It just sort of, or here's what I do too. You could say, I think he's saying this to them, or you could say, this kind of strikes me this way. Anybody? Why is he saying, I mean, the first thing he says is basically to pull the rug. I'm going to give you something really profound. There's nothing real or true or solid about anything. I've just given you nothing, in a sense. Anybody want to take a stab? Going once? Going twice?
I wonder if it's just so that they don't attach to it.
You're going to have to speak up for me because...
I wonder if it's to say it so that it cuts through the duality so that they don't attach to anything ultimately.
And so that they don't attach to anything. Right. And I was thinking as you were saying that they might be inclined to, because now it's the time that they're leaving their teacher. So when something dear to you is about to go, there's this wanting to hold on to something. There's this impulse to grab what's slipping away. So he might be psychologically saying, I want to not encourage you to get into a grasping state of mind at this point, even to these teachings. Because I think he's saying, I want you to respect this, I want you to take it up, I want you to cultivate, but if you cultivate according to it, it's like the raft, and now you've used it to go to another level. Don't even cling to that. So anybody else, why? Go ahead.
Sure. Is it possible he's also sort of reminding them what brought them to this practice in the first place? Their own sense that, hey, nothing that I see around me is permanent or makes me happy or whatever. Sort of clearing the slate so that they can then proceed through the other things that they might have learned and should keep them practicing even after he is gone.
Very interesting point. One of the things my teacher said to us is that what brought you in, what that impulse was, what was that first thing that brought you in, never lose that. And when you go down the road or a number of years in your practice and you get a little lost and confused, come back to that point again. That starting point, that first impulse that brought you in, because that's your true start. So in a sense, maybe they came in on that basis and now they've gotten many understandings, many texts they've looked at and whatnot, and he's kind of going back to that point. Don't substitute an attachment to the spiritual religious side because you've already given up all those other things. But the thing with renunciation, if you want to use that language, or I prefer letting go of what's false, is that one hand lets go and the other one grabs. It's a really funny thing. It's sort of like the mind that wants to hold on is very tricky. And you can let go of something, but without subduing that mind, it will just gravitate and pick up something else. And you actually feel as if you made some breakthrough, And then you say, well, why am I still feeling uptight and afflicted? Because the mind isn't at ease with that. So often, people that do this often talk about this during a retreat or something. They say, I'm going to give up candy during the retreat because I've got a real sweet tooth and it just overwhelms me. And so they give up candy, and then they find the desire for dumplings has gone through the roof. It's sort of like, or they give up dumplings, and then the desire for sweet soy milk goes up. And it's sort of like this hydra. You knock one head off, and then it comes out in another area, or a water balloon. You squeeze in one area, and it shrinks, but then it expands in the other. And so it's like the mind that wants to grasp and hold on to something that's real and solid is a lot harder to subdue than the objects the mind grasps and attaches to. And in fact, you can get into a kind of false liberation where you're renouncing everything. You're a hard-nosed and renouncer, right? And you are just going through no, no, no. And you're actually, one of the signs that you don't have it right is you criticize others who haven't renounced. You know, you weakling, you haven't been able to give that up. And so this is a kind of fighting. And I think, I'm jumping all around here a little bit, but when he says the root source of this teaching is non-contention, he's not just talking about with others, he's talking with yourself. If you're fighting with yourself in that way, in other words, objectifying desires as the things that you want rather than the mind that wants, and you don't attack that mind, it'll just substitute for another and another and another. And it gets kind of silly, it gets kind of neurotic, but there it is. And so you could actually, my teacher had this one thing, I told you the story, but he says like a bear going through a cornfield. And the bear's going through the cornfield, sees an ear of corn and grabs it. Like, oh, I got an ear of corn. And then it sees another ear of corn and grabs that. So it's walking kind of on its hind legs. Then it sees a third ear. So it puts this ear under its arm and drops that one, right? And then it's going through and it sees another one. It's like, oh, but I want that one. So it reaches out to grab that one and puts it here, but then this one falls out. And you can see, so it's just going back and forth. And by the end, the bear's only switched ears of corn, ended up with the same two if he's lucky. But the mind hasn't changed. So it's like we can go through our desires as a bear going through the cornfield. And we think that we're making some advance, but all what we're doing is kind of tricking ourselves, proliferating different ones. So anyhow, sometimes we call these hobbies. Anybody else on that? Anything, nothing real or true or saw?
I think it's interesting to think about how the mind finds comfort in finding something real. I mean, I get that the unreality of things, of mundane and material, just because of the nature of the flux and uncertainty of everything in this world as we know it. But then there's something comforting about thinking about this, like what's beyond this world, as in mindfulness or what have you, that's real. So I guess my question is, when you detach yourself enough from the physical world, and then you think about immersing yourself in the spiritual and the mindful part of yourself, how do you then deal with that also not being real? What do you have left at that point?
Well, this is where I think he's going. It's very interesting. He never makes that dichotomy between the physical world and the real world. Remember that famous verse, he says, Bodhi is right here in this world, not apart from this world. Looking for the spiritual Bodhi apart from this world is like looking for a rabbit with antlers. So his non-dual teaching is really not about this world or another world, but this mind. And so if the mind is clearly seeing things as they really are and not attaching and grasping at anything, that is the spiritual right within the material world. But if that mind is not gone, then right within the spiritual, you'll have a sort of material craving, only it's directed at the spiritual, but it's the same mind. So he's saying that Bodhi is a state of mind, it's not a different place. And that's why he says, to the awakened person, all places are the same. So that the challenge to us is to have that liberated, unbound mind wherever we are, and not have it rely on being in one place or another, because then it's still a conditioned thing. So this is the power of this kind of the verse, because it pushes us past a kind of dichotomy, a false dichotomy. Somebody else, were you going to say something?
I was going to say something but actually it resonates with some of what you were saying. Just the idea of seeing, as you said, like looking for a spiritual truth, something out there that's real. And then in the next verse, it's nice how he brings it back to actually you have to embody what's real.
You what?
You embody what's real, rather than finding some like not finding or seeing a truth. It's not here if you're looking for it, but if you're being it, that's.
He would almost say, I think, I'm putting a little bit, but not too much. You do not get enlightened. You do not get enlightened. You don't get enlightenment. Rather, awakening is something you become. It's not something you get, it's something you turn into. And then, when you turn into, what does that mean to turn into an awakened being? There's nothing to get. And that is the awakening is a letting go of wanting and getting anything whatsoever. He keeps coming back again. The mind that wants, the mind that craves, the mind that desires, this deep eigan, it's called, this deep root, is at the heart of our suffering. And so, to substitute it for, I'm going to get my awakening, it's just like, what's the difference between that and my Mercedes-Benz? Or, my ideal island someplace. It's the same mind. And so it's almost like, that's why he says he only expediently unties knots, because if he said he had a teaching, then give me that teaching. It was like Hui Neng chased him down for the robe and bowl. Give me the robe and bowl. He said, you want the robe and bowl? Well, no, I really want the Dharma. Well, you already have the Dharma. Just let go, release your hold. Oh, thank you. Isn't there something else? This is a thing that Hui Neng does. And there's a sense of, always wanting to get, always wanting to have something. And the quiet stillness and joy that comes from a little split second of just being content with not seeking and wanting at all is inconceivable. And yet we disrupt it immediately with like, oh, I want to get that space back again. And so, if it happened while you're bowing, then you go after bowing. If it happened while you're meditating, you go after meditating. If you're while you're riding your car, then you start driving around your car looking for this experience again. And so what he's saying, I think, is it doesn't mean there's nothing real and true at all. What he's saying, it's not in things, it's not in states. It can't be grasped, it can't be got at. So if you regard anything as real and true, this is just a view. It's an attachment, a projection. And it'll trip you up. So basically, he's, I think, in a very both immediate and maybe extended way, telling them his essential awakening. Let the mind be unattached, clinging to nothing, seeking nothing, wanting nothing, expecting nothing, looking for nothing, and so forth. And that very absence of that psychological thirst, Trishna, is in fact the end of suffering. Now that's something that you find throughout the Pali, the Mahayana, whatever you're looking at. This is the heart and core of that teaching. But it's so paradoxical. It's almost like it's so counterintuitive that it has to be said again and again. And right at the end, it's the first thing he reminds them of. Don't seek. Don't let that mind arise no matter what. Okay. We'll plow on a little bit here. If you can embrace the true yourself, and maybe this is what you were pointing to in the next line, that's the trigger point. If you can embrace, which means embody the true yourself, just being free of any falseness is the true mind. Now you see again, it's this, the use of not, without, absence in this text is always puzzled people because it seems to be it's kind of nihilistic. It's just saying there's nothing whatsoever, attaining, nothing to attain is the ultimate attainment and so forth. But there's wisdom behind that, because if we just go with what we just said, then letting go of that mind that wants and grasps, letting go of that desirous urge, just that, he says, letting go of that falseness, that's the true. If you put that down, the true naturally manifests by itself. But as you're pointing out, it's something that has to be embodied. It has to be coming viscerally from your whole being. It can't be a thought. It can't be a mantra you recite. It has to be something that is totally integrated into you. If your own mind is entangled in the false, then nothing's true. Where would you find the truth? This is a really, again, pointing to, it's through realization, through your own effort, through your own understanding that the true manifests. It's not coming from outside. And in fact, if you're not oriented, if you're not in sync with the way things really are, there's no way for the true to enter. The way, it's almost, the example I give is like a tuning fork. If the tuning fork is properly, at C or D, then it will resonate with C and D as it's manifested outside. But if the tuning fork is off, or your instrument is untuned, nothing is going to come out of there that's in tune. So you have to tune your own instrument. Poor metaphor, but you get it kind of where this is going. This is also can be technical about the false. One technical term for this are called the, in Chinese it's called the Si, like Er San Si, Diandao, Si Diandao, the four upside downs, or the four falseness. And this is an actual list, and you can use this at a meditative contemplation. It says, so you have four virtues of the awakened, liberated state called nibbana or nirvana. The four virtues are said to be a purity, a permanence, a true self, and a bliss beyond conditioned joy or sorrow. The four inversions are the opposite. So what is impure you take for pure. What is impermanent you take for permanent. What is not your true self you mistake to be your true self. And what is not the source of bliss and joy you take to be that. So this is called the four falseness or the four upside downs. And so then it becomes a contemplation, because you kind of, in your meditation practice, can ask, where am I setting up and seeking? What am I calling me and mine? Where is real source of pleasure and joy coming from, as opposed to what I'm going after? Am I trying to find permanence in impermanence? Whoa. I mean, just that one alone. Am I trying to get a sense of security and stability in things that intrinsically have none whatsoever? That could be in an acquisition of things. I mean, that's the first level. It could be in a relationship. Just finding that perfect relationship that you feel will, when you make your vows forever and ever, until death do us part. Nobody ever stops to think about that one, really. Till death do us part. When? It doesn't say when. It could be the very next day. People go to this and then, we're 80, we'll just sort of go off together. But that's not the case, because often one person goes before the other. And so what was a source of security and comfort can often turn into a source of anxiety. So much so that I've met older couples who say, my greatest fear is that he or she will go before I do. Or I will go before he or she does. But so that sense of trying to find permanent stability, security in things that are not secure and permanent is one of the upside downs. And the Lotus Sutra calls, you're using suffering to try to end suffering. You're using conditioned things to try to relieve a feeling of unconditioned insecurity, contingency kind of stuff. So we can take these lists, and they seem like lists, but then when you actually apply them, they become very interesting. So you could take those four: purity, permanence, true self, and bliss. And then the other one, what is this me? What is the real me? William James has a really interesting essay early on. He used to give talks to the undergraduates in the dormitories at night at Harvard. And one of his talks was, why not suicide? Oh no, it's really a good talk. But this talk, he says, basically he's asking a Buddhist question, who is me? And he goes into the undergraduates and he says, so how many selves do you have? And they're going like, no. And he says, well, don't you have like a social self? And this social self kind of has costumes and things it goes out and plays the social me. And then don't you have then a personal self? And don't you have a hidden self and a manifest self? And he goes through, and the students are starting to get a sense of they don't know who they are, but they're constantly changing who they are in relation to an external environment or demands. But when alone with themselves, truly alone with themselves, they're very uncomfortable. And so he's sort of, this would be great if professors would do this today. At campuses, just sort of stir this up. But even someone like William James was aware that what we call self may not actually be self. And I think, at least for me as I was growing up, somewhere around the age of 14 or 15, this became sort of my koan, my riddle. Who is this? Who am I? Am I basically the son of my parents? Am I the devotee of this religious group I belong to? Am I, this athletic presence I present to my friends? Am I the goody two-shoes I present to my teachers? And, and so on and so forth. And I started and sometimes you wake up at night, in the middle of the night, and you can't find yourself. If you know what I mean, it's like there's just this sort of sense without a kind of something to bounce off of. It's really a question: who is this, and what is this all about? Anyways, that's a contemplation you can use here, and there's a sense that letting go of the false in cultivation has to do at a very early stage of breaking away from false selves. And that could be sort of like a cultural thing. It could be a gender identity. It could be your career. I am this thing that I'm doing, my career, my métier. It could be I'm my smarts. I'm my muscles. I'm my beauty and skin. I'm my allure. I'm my anarchist. I'm my turn everybody off. That's who I am. So there's a kind of letting go of peeling away these layers. Anyhow, it's, yes?
Can you be all of the above? Can the self be all of the above? And then none of the above last forever?
It can be interchangeably all of the above. Come on. You go to a meditation retreat, there's a different self there. You leave the meditation retreat and call your mother, there's a different self there. You call your lover, there's a different self there. You call IRS, there's a different self there. We've got all these things, and we wear them as costumes, and I'm not putting them down necessarily. There's an element of survival here. But at some point, as you get older, you're saying, what is this all about? I'm just on this merry-go-round dramatic play. I go backstage and I put on a costume and I come out. Shakespeare's right. All the world's a stage, and we're all players like this. But at some point you start to say, what is there anything real there other than these sort of like a chameleon? I'm changing colors all the time for the background. And really, this is where the Buddha begins his cultivation too. He says, this thing has come in. It's going to get old. It's going to pass away. And what is there to this? And he said, it's like, well, it's an onion. You peel off one layer, you peel off another layer, peel off another layer, but onions don't have cores. So, when you start peeling off the layers, where is this? This, to some extent, is the questioning of the false, seeking the true. The proposition the Sixth Patriarch is making here, and I think all the great teachers make, is unless you let go of the false, you won't be able to find the true. The actual hanging onto the false obscures the true. So there's this vulnerability that has to take place when you're cultivating to sort of let down. Some of our students we were debriefing after the Guanyin recitation session this week, and some of them really expressed the idea that what the recitation did in the atmosphere of reciting was to make them aware of the armor they had put over themselves, to sort of move through the world, and that the armor was, in one hand, protecting them from being bruised, but on the other hand, also impeding their movement and covering them over and obstructing a kind of opening to their true heart. But to open that up and let the armor go created a feeling of vulnerability. And yet my experience, at least with cultivating with my teacher, was it wasn't until you got really vulnerable that things started to really happen and you really got a teaching. I mean, if you came in with some pretension or some armor, he'd play with it a little bit, or probably just ignore us. But as soon as you opened it just a crack, you go, and then it would be there. Because it's in that letting go of the armor that you can start to open up. So much of cultivation at the beginning isn't so much seeking Bodhi, but in examining where the false coverings are, and then skillfully removing them. If you're young, you feel I can do this. I got a long time. I'll do this one this year and this one next year. As you start to get older, you kind of want to jettison more and more quickly. And as sickness and death come, you'll get some help, because sickness and death will pull them away for you. So it's sort of like part of cultivation is to understand that these cannot be held on forever, and that actually they're not as useful as they seem. And even though it feels vulnerable, it might be a healthy embodiment, new body to let go and challenge and question these. And generally they don't feel very good either, but this last line to me is, unless you do this, unless you square yourself away and get real, there's no place you're going to find the true. This is a very interesting line. It's not like you get the true when you're tilted or off balance or holding on to something. The true, actually, whatever that true is, can only resonate and come through when there's no obstruction, no impediment, no pretensions, no hanging on or clinging to anything. And then all of a sudden it just manifests. So this is really, now who he's talking to here, seems to me he's still making sure that they stay in that vulnerable place even as they go out as teachers. I think this is probably very critical, because unless they embody that, that's half the lesson. Anybody that encounters it, I'm going to teach you the true, forget it. It's not going to happen. It's only going to happen if they're in the embodiment of that, also showing that vulnerability and openness. Okay. Well, I'm not going to keep you over tonight. We'll kind of put a stop there and pick up. I want to go more into this verse because there's both some technical terms here. And I want to deal a little bit with on this thing called appearances, which is coming up in this verse here, skillfully discerning amid all appearances. There's different ways to talk about, different lists to talk about that, and it's really quite useful. But what I'm going to suggest is that even though this is meant for his senior disciples are leaving, I still think there's a great deal here. If we just unpack a little bit more, that would be pretty rich for us as well. And in a sense, the Buddha said at one point, his teaching was of a single flavor. It was sweet at the beginning, sweet at the middle, and sweet at the end. Part of the meaning of that is that the same flavor should be throughout this teaching, even though it's meant for the senior disciples as for beginners. We just have to sort of read it through our own experience. So like those 4 inversions, 4 upside downs, just sort of do a contemplation is, am I mistaking what is impure for pure? And of course you can do the other way around too. You can mistake what's pure as impure. So they can be versed, and you can mistake what's your true self or not your true self. And so you can actually move away from those. You can move away from straightness to upside downness and vice versa. Probably doesn't make sense, but think about it. Any other questions? No great stories tonight.
A question left over from last week.
Oh,
So we were talking about...
that's a pressing question if it's left over from last week.
It's on my mind. So, of course, the topic last week was the folks crying and how that showed that they were still attached to their master and haven't really dealt with their... I don't remember the exact words.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Sorrow and joy do not stir in you.
So I remember you once telling a story about how the master himself, Master Hua, was in a group and hearing about some situation where there were a lot of suffering children, I think, and that he actually was shedding tears. And so I wonder, is that distinguished perhaps by the fact that that was an act of empathy rather than his own suffering and sense of loss, or where do you parse those?
So, did I finish the tear thing? I think I did.
Yeah.
I finished talking about tears. So the point I was making, we know little about why we cry and why some people don't cry. But we do know that tears are not of a single kind, but run across a continuum. There's, for example, a Romanian philosopher called Sioran who wrote a text, very interesting, called The Tears of the Saints, which is very different than the tears of a broken-hearted lover, or the tears that will come after November 6th or something. So in this case, the tears here are coming from an unexamined clinging to a kind of falseness of almost like things don't pass and things don't die. It's an emotional attachment. And then when that is broken, that attachment that they had is so challenged that they cry because it's beyond anything they can absorb. It's so powerful. And this happens with both joy and grasping and attaching. So something that you're really attached to, when it goes uncontrollably, you cry, but it's not necessarily a good, healthy, therapeutic cry you're feeling so much as a sort of a tearing away. So the story I told, that's the kind of tying that's going here. He's saying, because earlier on in this text, you see there's many times disciples cry, and he doesn't say that then. It's because they cry because they let go of something and have an insight. And they go, oh my gosh, I didn't see that before. He doesn't say, so why are you crying? No, because it's a changing, I say metaphorically, it's like ice going back into fluid water. So they're going from the frozen to the more fluid, and that dam of armor breaks, and there's a release of tears there. So the story I told about my teacher was, I seldom saw, this is the only time I saw him cry. And we were at a conference, we're holding a conference, and give you the background. He was listening very carefully to psychologists and sociologists talking about the condition of children in America at that time. Children that basically were neglected, abused, separated from their parents and put with foster systems that even furthered the abuse and so forth. And it was pretty stunning as the statistics were rendered. And as he listened to this, and I was sitting next to him, looked over, I saw a tear come from his eye. Now, as I read that, and then his response afterwards told me it wasn't the same as this. It had to do with a kind of, there's a verse, being one with everyone is called great compassion. And so it was like this empathy of almost identity with the children. And I saw, and the parents who were doing this and so forth, the whole system that was creating this abuse of the human, of child human potential, because by the abuser and the abused are both tying themselves up. And so then afterwards, what he said was, we need to make this place, which was a city of 10,000 Buddhas, a place for this healing and wholeness of humanity. That's what I call the nature, and therefore the emphasis on the schools, elementary, secondary, and also about teaching parents how to be parents was the response. But the first was, I could even say he could see that human nature was abusing itself, and that was a sadness. Here are these potential great human beings, or even Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but through this ignorance have now created this situation, and it was like, almost like a parent seeing the child hurt. It was a different kind of tear than, oh, woe is me, someone's leaving. So I'm suggesting here that with reading of these texts, and even laughter, you have to always look at context and say, where is it? It's not the tears itself that are good or bad, but the situation in which they occur. And I think for someone he might even say, he might have looked at me at that moment and said, how come you're not crying? You know, how can you sit here and just listen to what you just heard and not feel what that must feel like to those, both parents and children, and not have this kind of empathetic response? So, yeah. Good question. Somehow I knew you were going to ask that. Yeah. Yeah, Feta.
I've heard Snesna's story of Master. I was giving a teaching on certain mantras, and there was a person in the audience who said, "Yeah, Master, my mother's dying, and I'm wondering which mantra I should recite." And according to the story, the Master goes, "If your mother's dying, you shouldn't be worrying about which mantra you're saying. You should be crying."
Ah.
Which I've always thought was a very interesting.
Huh. And again, I would never generalize.
Mm-hmm.
See, okay, so this is everybody heard the story, right? So then you would go out and say, okay, anybody who's somebody's dying, say, you should be crying, you should be crying, you should be crying. But in this particular case, if he's skillfully untying knots, then what he was untying was a kind of denial of some deep feeling that she had to get through in order to get true. And so if you think, I'm a cultivator and I'm not going to cry, I'm just going to recite a mantra, that may actually be not appropriate for you at that time. It might be more appropriate for you to cry and then da-da-da-da-da. So, but another person in another situation could say, cry, let it out. And in this case, why are you crying? Mm-hmm. So the thing is that there's no absolute black or white here. It's always what unties the knot. And the knot, knowing what that knot is, what unties the covering over wisdom. It's not just cathartic release of emotions. Because sometimes that can be outflowing, and sometimes that can be liberation. And you have to be able to, wow, it's not so simple. Okay, we're going to do I'm sure there's a lecture tomorrow night, probably Jinfo Shi, because I just was texting with Hung Shi. He celebrated his birthday in China again, this life. He said three birthdays in China in his lifetime. So his birthday was Halloween, and I said, happy birthday. Are there pumpkins in China? And so forth. But they're going to be coming back, I believe, this weekend. So Jinhui, Jinchuan, and Hung Shi will be coming back. And so then I'm sure next week he will pick up on the Avatamsaka lectures again. Is there any other announcements? Anybody knows anything to?
There's another event at the public library in San Francisco.
Right, I heard there's something going on. Anybody know what that is at the public library this weekend?
I actually don't know anything else about it.
Something about DRBU, because somebody told me about it. Okay, so, and then there's a third weekend that's going on at the library around that exhibit there. So check online, I guess, because I really don't know, and nobody else seems to know here either. Okay, let's do the transference. Hey, every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see Bow in respect to the three jewels.